Welcome, friends. My name is Elias. I'm the director of the program in Jewish Studies here at CU Boulder. I'm also noticing we may be having some technical issues right now. I hope that folks can hear me. I think we'll be reconnecting the sound in one moment. But it's such a pleasure to welcome you all here tonight to this webinar entitled Yiddish Paris, Creating a Jewish Nation Between Two World Wars, with Professor Nick Underwood from the College of Idaho. Tonight's program is part of our Peak to Peak series, which is an initiative that fosters conversation between CU Boulder on the one hand, and audiences and communities across Colorado on the other. It's supported by CU's Office for Outreach and Engagement, and it's a partnership with communities and civic organizations across Colorado. And I want to begin by just thanking those communities and those organizations, in particular the Corazon de Trinidad Creative District, the Garfield Public Library District, the Trinidad Carnegie Public Library, Western Colorado University, the Aspen Jewish Congregation, the Boulder JCC, Kavod on the Road, and Temple Aaron in Trinidad. As always, we are so deeply grateful for your partnership. In a moment, I'll introduce you to Professor Underwood, who will be guiding us through our conversation tonight. In a moment also, we'll sort of resolve the technical difficulties that I suspect for some of you is leading me to appear as just a small box kind of floating on your screen. But before I turn things over to Professor Underwood, before we finish resolving those technical difficulties, I want to say a few words about the conversation we're going to be having tonight, both about kind of who's made that conversation possible and about what that conversation will look like. So first, I want to offer a few words about the support that's made this conversation possible. As I mentioned, we're deeply grateful to CU's Office for Outreach and Engagement for its support and for its support of the Peak to Peak series. But I also want to acknowledge that, like all of our public programming, tonight's gathering is also supported by the David Schneer Fund for Community Programming, Public Scholarship, and the Arts. This fund honors the memory of our friend and colleague, Professor David Schneer, who was a passionate believer in the importance of precisely the kind of conversation we're going to have tonight, a conversation that brings together diverse faculty, students, staff, and members of the public to think together. David was actually Professor Underwood's doctoral advisor here at CU, and I know that he is on our mind tonight. Now, let me offer a word about what tonight's program will look like. I just described this program as a conversation, and that's really how we see it, as a space for conversation. And this is going to take three forms. So first, after Professor Underwood shares some words, after he presents, he and I will be in conversation with one another for about 10 to 15 minutes. Second, after that, we want to open things up for a conversation, not just between me and Professor Underwood, but also between all of you and Professor Underwood. And the way you can participate in that conversation is by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that, you can write in a question and it will be visible to me. And I'll try to share it with Professor Underwood and with the group, and he will then respond. And you don't need to wait to the end of his remarks to share your question. You can start adding those questions as soon as they occur to you during the presentation. I'll keep track of them and collate them and make sure that they get to Professor Underwood. And finally, we want this to be an opportunity, not just for a conversation between me and Professor Underwood, and not just for a conversation between all of you and Professor Underwood, and just also an opportunity for conversations between you and your fellow participants. So if you click on the chat function, as many of you are already doing, you can write a comment to the group as a whole right now. Just make sure that you're addressing that comment to everyone. During the program, your comments will be visible available only to me and to Professor Underwood. But right now, if you click on the chat function and set it to address everyone, your comment will be visible to everyone. And so as I introduce our speaker tonight, I encourage you to share a greeting with the group if you haven't done so already, to say who you are, where you're from, and why you decided to learn with us tonight. We are a community, and community is built through these kinds of connections. And we'll open up the chat function again at the end of the evening. Okay, none of you is here to listen to me, so now let me introduce you to tonight's speaker. Nick Underwood is the Berger-Neilsen Chair of Judaic Studies and an assistant professor of history at the College of Idaho. Prior to joining the College of Idaho faculty, he held postdoctoral fellowships at the University of Michigan and the University of California, Berkeley. He's also been a member of the Digital Yiddish Theater Project. And prior to that, he received his PhD in history with an endorsement in Jewish studies from CU Boulder in 2016. And part of why tonight is such a joy for me and such a joy for so many of us who are here tonight is that Nick was actually a student in the very first seminar I taught at CU back in fall 2012. And we're just so honored to be able to host him for a presentation on his newly published book, Yiddish Paris, Staging Nation and Community in Interwar France. Came out just this year with Indiana University Press. If you haven't purchased the book already, you should immediately do so right now. I am putting a link to do so in the chat. And I am also putting 2 promo codes in the chat. So until September 30th, you can buy Professor Underwood's book for 50% off from that website using the promo code FIGHTER. And after September 23rd, you can save 30% by using the promo code SAVE30. With that, I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to turn things over to our presenter tonight, Professor Nick Underwood.
Thank you, Eli, for that really wonderful introduction. And I'm watching the chat as people are chiming in and saying hello. And it's a real thrill and honor to be invited to share my research and work with you, but also just to be a part of this program. I remember when I was a graduate student at Boulder, working with Jamie Poliard to help support programs like this. So to actually be part of one of the programs is an absolute thrill. Let me start sharing my screen here. And oops. Should have. All right. So we can get started. But again, I wanted to thank everybody for being here. It's a real thrill, and it's really touching and just remarkable to see so many familiar names in the participant list, and everyone chiming in and kind of saying where they're from. It's really great. A lot of my work kind of thinks very broadly about kind of like the global connections of people. And it's really interesting to see that kind of represented in this in the chat as this event is going forward. Also, this is a bit of a homecoming for me, although I am in my office in Idaho. As Eli mentioned, CU Boulder is where I did my PhD. I have it was a very supportive space and of the history department. I see members here today, and it's pretty wild. I worked very closely on my dissertation committee with David Charlo and Martha Hanna, and this project they helped shepherd this thing through from a dissertation to a book, and also David Schneer, who I'd like to dedicate this talk to his memory, and I've not done this before, so please excuse me. But in the acknowledgements, I wrote something about the influence that he had on me and on this project, and I'd like to read this for you before we start talking, or before I start talking, and then we will talk. This book would not have been possible without David Schneer's guidance, who, from very early on, encouraged me to find the sources that some felt might be impossible to locate. Then, once I found those sources, he challenged me again and again to think and rethink my analysis and conclusions. He did not get a chance to see this book in print, so I'm dedicating it in his memory. David's touch and light can be felt and seen on almost every page of this book. Thank you for that and giving me this opportunity to share those words, and now share some of my research and what kind of comes from this book. We'll come back to the slide in a bit, and I'll actually explain what this image that you're seeing is towards the end. In late December 1919, 50 people met at a cafe in Paris's third arrondissement to create an executive committee for the newly established group La Culture Juive. Leo Glazer was a former Secretary General of the short-lived League for the Defense of Oppressed Jews, was unanimously nominated president. Glazer, poised in his suit and tie and small, round wire glasses, declared that La Culture Juive would stand for Jewish unity and that the group would be an outlet where, quote, members can learn about everything related to the Jews. One person then stood up to ask about the group's political stance. At this moment, responded Glazer, it is not about that. Over the next 2 years, La Culture Juive would help create the base for a thriving interwar Yiddish cultural scene. Yiddish Paris, staging nation and community in interwar France, is the biography of the sometimes forgotten homeland of Yiddish diasporic nationalism in Western Europe, France, and more specifically Paris. The origins of that flourishing were found at that first meeting of La Culture Juive, and Glazer was to play a great role. He would find himself involved in almost every major Yiddish cultural institution to emerge in France during the interwar years. His apolitical ideal would fade through the course of the 1920s and the 1930s, but the idea of creating culture in the Yiddish language that could appeal to all corners of the Jewish street was one that would remain until the fall of the French Third Republic in July 1940. To highlight the particular trajectory of Yiddish culture in interwar France and Yiddish, the lingua franca of not just Jews in Eastern Europe, but Jews originating from Eastern Europe, wherever they may have found themselves, Yiddish Paris tells the story of Yiddish cultural institutions such as the Kulturliga, or the Culture League, the Medem Farband, or the Medem Association, the Yiddish Wissenschaftliche Institute, or the YIVO, the Institute for Jewish Research, as well as groups, events, performances, and meetings that those bodies organized. This demonstrates how Yiddish-speaking Jews in France tried to create a sense of French belonging that balanced ideals of Frenchness, such as support for the French Republic, and diaspora nationalism, an Eastern European Jewish import that, in the French context, was an attempt to carve out a culturally autonomous Yiddish language space within the larger French cultural scene. Yiddish culture was certainly produced by Jewish immigrants in France prior to the Great War, but it was during the interwar years that Yiddish cultural productions began a more clearly focused attempt to build a diasporic identity that would enable Yiddish speakers to perform both civic Frenchness and cultural Jewishness. Added to this was a clear Yiddishist impulse that, within this particular French Jewish community, would profoundly shape the form that Jewishness would take. This was a new framing of Yiddish culture in France. Given the fraught politics of interwar France within both Jewish and French circles, the success of this cultural project relied entirely on Glazer's model. It needed to be apolitical so that it could bring together the variety of political groups, many of which were antagonistic towards one another, and all of which that were active during the 1920s and the 1930s in France. For example, by the 1930s, there were active Bundists, Jewish socialists, communists, and Zionist groups. Although Yiddish culture was often produced by partisans of these political ideologies, it would ultimately bring unity to parts of the Yiddish-speaking community in France. Glazer was part of a transnational circle of friends that included the writer Sholem Asch, the painters Marc Chagall and Manet Katz, and the sculptor Nachum Aronson. After La Culture Juive disbanded in 1921, Glazer would become active in the Kulturliga Paris and later YIVO Paris. As a delegate at the 1937 First International Yiddish Culture Congress, which took place in September of 1937 in Paris, he would help found the Paris branch of the Yiddish Kulturverband, or the YIKUF, the Yiddish Cultural Association. Here we have a letterhead from the Paris office of the interwar YIKUF. After the occupation of France, he and others set up the resistance group La Rue Amelot. Glazer's interwar cultural and political trajectory is emblematic of how Yiddish Paris operated. These activists were politically and culturally minded and hoped to reconcile their place within both the transnational Yiddish cultural world and the boundaries of the French Third Republic. Now, we cannot speak about interwar Yiddish culture without talking about this particular space here. Located in the 10th arrondissement near the Place de la République and the Marais, 10 Rue de l'Ancre, which was informally referred to simply as l'Ancre, was centrally located in relation to the working class quarters of interwar Paris. It was already a hub of immigrant Jewish activity. However, as some scholars have called it, a veritable stock exchange for newly arrived immigrants, one could spend a first night there, find work as a dressmaker or mechanic in the garment industry, or simply chat and make some new acquaintances. The Kulturliga was just one of the many Jewish organizations, including several mutual aid organizations or Landwirtschaften, that l'Ancre would host in its office space. Its theater, which we see a picture of here, its theater space also hosted political meetings and a number of Yiddish theater performances during the 1920s and the 1930s. Many foreigners found residence somewhere in Paris. Among the Russians, Romanians, Poles, Italians, Belgians, and Spaniards in Paris by the mid-1930s were Yiddish-speaking Jewish immigrants from across Eastern Europe, a community that had grown immensely during the interwar years. In 1919, there were approximately 80,000 Eastern European immigrant Jews in Paris. This number jumped to approximately 150,000 by the mid-1930s. Larger than most Jewish communities in Poland, with the exception of Warsaw and Łódź, although about 1/10 of the size of the Jewish population of New York. So to kind of put in context and perspective the size of this Yiddish-speaking community, and these numbers are from the mid to late 1930s. These Jews would make their new home in a city unlike any that they had lived in before. Even those hailing from large, bustling cities in Eastern Europe, Paris was a new experience. For some, the challenges of moving to the city of light were compounded by the seeming absence of a clearly defined Jewish cultural community into which they could integrate. Indeed, as ostensibly foreign reminders of their French co-religionists' ethnic and religious difference, Yiddish-speaking Eastern European Jews were not widely welcomed into the established French Jewish community. Their response is therefore important for understanding the variety of ways that a global Yiddish culture can develop. These are actually pictures here of, the site actually does not look like this anymore. These are pictures from 2014 of the facade of the building. On the bottom left, you can kind of see construction doing on the inside of the kind of the center of the building. But on the top left, where you can see the railing from the balcony above, if you look closely, this is actually not even here anymore. But if you look closely, you can see light bulbs from which was the marquee from when l'Ancre was a theater back in the 1930s. It has now been completely remodeled and is not like this anymore. But there was still kind of remnants even until very recently. Successive waves of Eastern European Jews fled to France in 1905, 1918, 1920, 1922, and 1933. And each wave left their homeland for different reasons, ranging from political turmoil and exclusion to anti-Semitism, violent pogroms, economic catastrophe, the collapse of empires, nationalism, and the rise of fascism. But they were all pulled to France by its reputation as a land of economic, social, political, or national opportunity. Excuse me. It therefore proved fertile ground in the interwar years for the development of Yiddishist diaspora nationalism, which was certainly a malleable national ideal. Like other immigrants in interwar France, Yiddish-speaking cultural activists constructed, through the development of their cultural activities, an alternative diasporic and French identity, one that I've called Franco-Yiddishness. The organizations that Yiddish cultural activists created would help establish Paris as a Western European hub of Yiddish culture. Recognizing the need for familiarity and a new home, immigrant Jews in interwar Paris adopted their Eastern European diaspora nationalism to fit their new cultural, political, and social contexts. They did this by founding a wide variety of Yiddish cultural and scholarly institutions, staging theatric performances and organizing theater troupes also, creating Yiddish language courses and French language courses, of course, developing an international Yiddish culture congress, and participating in the 1937 World's Fair. These are actually postcards here from the 1937 World's Fair. We can talk about the World's Fair later if anyone's interested. Some of these are representations of the walls of the fair. I tried to get too many in here and I apologize for that, but here we have a smattering of kind of what was on display at that very famous, at least now, World's Fair. Parisian Yiddish language newspapers were also a major component and were tied to these efforts. And during the 1920s and 1930s, there were both dailies and weeklies. Paula Hyman estimates that there were more than 130 Yiddish periodicals that appeared between 1918 and 1939. The major newspapers were Pariser Heint, so Paris Today, and Neue Presse, or the New Press. Pariser Heint was the Parisian outpost of the Warsaw-based Zionist-leading Heint. It began publication, in 1926, and it ran until 1940. Neue Presse was a daily published originally under the auspices of the French Communist Party. It ran first from 1934 to 1939 before going underground, and then it would publish again openly from 1944 until 1993. There were numerous other Yiddish language newspapers too, as I mentioned. At the same time, this cultural activity also embedded Yiddish culture into larger yet leftist cultural frameworks in France. And the cosmopolitan, international, and anti-colonial character of this broader French milieu made the question of what it meant to be French a particularly pressing one. The French left placed Jewish immigrants under restrictions and laws that made them comparable to colonial subjects. And this was kind of for immigrants more broadly within France. Officially, their immigrant status all but squashed their ability to participate formally in politics because immigrants were barred from political action. Moreover, all immigrants faced constant police monitoring. Nevertheless, despite the fact that Jews in interwar Paris held a tendentious social, political, and cultural status throughout the 1920s and the 1930s, their cultural activity allowed them a political voice. The French and global political issues of these decades affected how immigrant Jews organized, created, and staged their Parisian Yiddish cultural project. The City of Light was unique in terms of the outlets and forms of Yiddish culture it produced. Significantly, it claimed branches of the Kiev-based Kulturliga, which was a transnational Yiddish cultural organization that existed in the 1920s and the 1930s, mostly in Europe. The Vilna-based YIVO, the New York-based Arbeiterring, or the Workers' Circle, or for a while also known as the Workmen's Circle, and the Linke Positionsarbeiterheim, as well as homegrown Yiddish institutions like La Culture Juive. It also hosted international traveling Yiddish theater and developed the theater choruses and troupes. Paris's Yiddish cultural institutions represented both the old world, so the Kulturliga and YIVO, although YIVO now is based in New York. Here we have some documents from the Paris branch of the YIVO office, and the new world, the Arbeiterring, which was based in New York. It was a peculiar twist of fate that in post-World War I era of national and international upheaval, the city of Paris fostered these vibrant expressions of Jewish diaspora nationalism. This was at least partially due to the rise of the Popular Front in the 1930s, which carried with it a brand of left-wing nationalism. Yiddish Paris therefore traverses two historical contexts, one national, that of interwar France, and one transnational, that of Eastern European Jews, who by this point had found themselves all over the globe. to better understand immigrant Jews' cultural production. So I take these two frameworks and kind of work through them to better understand what it was and why it was that this immigrant community was producing the types of works that they were. The vibrant Parisian Yiddish culture of the 1920s and 1930s emerged from the nexus of relationships between those Eastern European Jews who had arrived in Paris before World War I, those who arrived after it, and the French cultural influences they encountered in their new country. In turn of the century Europe, a transnational Yiddish language renaissance catalyzed a Jewish nationalism that was based on based on a civic understanding of French national belonging. This nationalist movement was shaped by peculiarities of the Eastern European Jewish historical experience and would take on pacifist undertones in the wake of World War I. During the 1920s, these Jewish nationalist roots were then grafted onto France. In response to social and political shifts during the 1930s, Yiddish diaspora nationalists in Paris tried to align their cultural and nationalist activities with French cultural and political movements, most notably in the wake of the 1930s refugee crisis, and like I mentioned before, the rise of the Popular Front. Once in France, Yiddish cultural activists reframed their projects to fit the cultural, social, and political climates of the Third Republic. Organizations that began as unaffiliated in the 1920s, such as La Culture Juive, would gravitate towards a more general leftism during the 1930s. Although a great number of Yiddish-speaking immigrant Jews had called France home since the early 20th century, many of their cultural endeavors did not emerge as feasible long-term projects until after World War I. Jewish immigrant cultural activists embraced a heightened sense of anti-clericalism rather than anti-religious sentiment, became staunch defenders of French Republican ideals, linked themselves ideologically to the French pacifist movement of the post-World War I era, only seemingly amending their pacifism during the late 1930s, and participated in a cultural project that brought together all of these forces. The chapters of Yiddish Paris each focus on a particular component of each interwar Yiddish culture in Paris: the Kulturliga, the Medem Farband, which is an organization that is at the root of the Medem Bibliothek and the Medem Center, which are two Yiddish cultural organizations that still operate in Paris today. This is the origins of these organizations. Yiddish theater, in particular, a group that I write about called PIAT, or the Pariser Yiddische Avant-Garde Theater, or the Parisian Yiddish Avant-Garde Theater, and Yiddish courses, and even the Medem's mandolin orchestra, which was short-lived during the 1930s. I also pay close attention to the year 1937, which saw Paris host the World's Fair, which itself hosted a pavilion dedicated to Yiddish culture, as well as an international culture congress. During the 1930s and During the 1920s and 1930s, Paris supported a Yiddish culture that simultaneously advocated Jewish cultural and national autonomy and French civic integration. Despite political infighting at the top, Yiddish cultural activists were able to subvert party politics by interrogating the role culture had in staging their new community. Surely, politics were apparent in even the most politically unaffiliated Yiddish cultural group. However,
Professor Underwood, I'm
yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I just want to make sure we've received a few messages that at least some people are seeing a screen with no image right now. We just
that's correct.
I want to make sure that was intentional. Okay.
Yeah, it's intentional.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Perfect. So sorry for interrupting.
No worries. Even when these groups were unaffiliated cultural groups, there was still politics kind of involved in them, right? However, what set these groups apart from other party organizations was the broader, albeit still leftist, spectrum of politics represented in both their programming and their member lists. What infighting there was in the Parisian community was either short-lived or limited to organizational leadership rather than extending to the rank and file. This bottom-up cooperation defined Yiddish Paris. Just like the woman on the cover of the book, which is taken from the Yiddish language guide for the 1937 World's Fair, the Parisian Yiddishist and diaspora nationalist project posed Eastern European Jewish diaspora nationalism alongside French republicanism in a surprisingly successful cultural enterprise. And this multicultural experiment broadens our understanding of both the Eastern European Yiddish-speaking diaspora and the boundaries of the French Republic. Yiddish-speaking immigrants in interwar Paris were an ingredient in a figurative French salad bowl rather than a melting pot. Immigrant Jews were part of the French imperial nation state in that they positioned their national project within the parameters of the French Republic. They did not function independent of the state. In fact, they wanted to be embraced by it. And as a result, they fostered a unique Franco-Yiddishness that they thought would preserve their national autonomy and guard against the fascists, whom they feared would ultimately destroy this unique national leftist and Republican project. And this was, and to some extent still is, Yiddish Paris. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Underwood, for that really, really engaging and rich presentation. In a moment, I'm going to turn things over to I'm going to kind of try to share some of the questions that we're receiving from others, but first, using the kind of vast authority invested in me as the holder of the webinar license, I'm going to begin with a few questions of my own. I will just encourage folks to please feel free to put some questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and again, I'll get to them soon. But I guess, Nick, first, I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about how you came to this project. How did you find yourself writing a book on this remarkable moment in modern Jewish history, Yiddish history, French history? How did you come to this project?
So well, I think it's an interesting story. We'll see if others agree. But Martha might remember, but when I started my program, I thought that I was going to be working on the Spanish Civil War. And I started doing readings to kind of really bolster that potential approach. There are two books that are written, there are many books written about Jews in France. There was two books in particular that I was reading, and they mentioned the kind of Yiddish cultural world that were there. They were talked a lot about kind of Eastern European Jewish immigrants. In each book, one of them made a reference to a Yiddish theater, and in a footnote made comment about what the name of the Yiddish theater was. And the other one made a comment about a Yiddish chorus, like a singing group that existed in the 1930s. And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. I want to know more about that. And I started poking around and realized that was really the extent of, especially in English, what has been written about them. One of the reasons for that is because many people thought the records or archival records were not available. But that is kind of where the idea for this project came from. I was like, I want to write about Yiddish theater and Yiddish choruses in interwar France, and then we'll see where that leads me. That led me to the discovery of the Kulturliga. That led me to the discovery. I knew about MEDEM, the Farband, because of the library still in existence. Led me to the discovery of the Evo Paris office, and led me also to the discovery of the Yiddish Culture Pavilion, which I learned by reading the French newspaper in the 1930s. They actually announced it, and I was like, oh, that's another thing I need to look into. So it's kind of, at first, a couple of footnotes that piqued my interest and wanted to read more about it, and then I learned that I was going to have to be the one to write about it so that I could read more about it. But that's kind of where the origins came from. Just kind of like, I put somewhere in the book that, there's projects buried in footnotes, right? And we need to keep close attention to them. But that's where this was sparked.
Well, thank you for that. Well, the questions are coming in fast and furious. So in a moment, I'm going to turn to those questions, but I'm going to just ask one or two more kind of about this project that you felt that you had to write, and about this story that you're telling. And, one question I'd like to ask is a story that sort of situate one question I'd like to ask situates the story in its own context. Another question I'd like to ask maybe sort of situates the story in our context today. You alluded towards the beginning of your presentation about what was sort of distinctive about Yiddish culture in Paris. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. In what ways was this Yiddish culture in Paris similar to, say, Yiddish culture in New York or in other areas at the time? And in what ways was this Yiddish culture in Paris different from Yiddish culture in other kinds of geographic regions at the time?
Sure. So it's a lot of what's being produced is reminiscent of what's happening in places like New York, like Buenos Aires, like Warsaw, right? There is a kind of a familiar tone to it, right? A lot of, especially with the regards of theater and singing, a lot of the repertoire was one that would have been recognizable to a lot of people in the Yiddish-speaking kind of global world. So there's lots of overlaps. Also, the people who are involved, right? At least in the secular Yiddish world, there's a lot of, tends to be, not always, but tended towards the left, tended to be a little bit more politically engaged. And those were the same people who were producing Yiddish culture in 1920s and 1930s France. I say France because some of the institutions I mentioned actually wind up opening branches in Metz, Nancy, and Strasbourg, but most of their work was in Paris. So there's these overlaps kind of in terms of repertoire and kind of the types of people who were involved in these projects. What winds up being specific to the French context is that they really try to tie a lot of these initiatives to what's happening in France. They, at the beginning of the Popular Front, really a year into the Popular Front, they address the World's Fair and they want to have a pavilion there because it's being staged in Paris. And they really see them kind of tying themselves to a larger kind of French initiative to kind of embrace a lot of different kind of communities that were in France at the time. They're trying to make inroads with, so the one of the newspapers I did not mention is a Bundes newspaper. They wind up doing a program with a leftist French newspaper and have Léon Blum speak at an event. So they really try to integrate themselves very much so into the French national sphere. And even the theater, they wind up kind of borrowing some of the staging techniques from like really minimalist kind of avant-garde theater that's happening in 1920s and 1930s, and doing it in such a way actually that French critics wind up recognizing it as part of their French avant-garde because of the way that it's staging. I actually write about theater critics who start their reviews off saying, I don't speak any Yiddish, but this is some of the best avant-garde that France has to offer, right? So like they did a lot to kind of like emulate and speak to some of the cultural norms that they were seeing in 1920s and 1930s Paris to really kind of stage and reframe some of the production. So it may have been a very familiar, I don't know, Shalom Aleichem play that they would have done, but they would have done it in a way that would have kind of echoed some of what was happening elsewhere in the city.
Well, so maybe sort of following up on that theme, on the sort of distinctiveness of this Parisian Yiddish culture, the distinctiveness of this episode. Towards the end of your remarks, you gestured towards the broader lessons that we might derive from this distinctive episode, broader lessons for Jewish history, the history of Yiddish, the history of France. And I was wondering if I could invite you, maybe say a little bit more about that, right? We have this distinctive moment where on the one hand, we have this Yiddish culture that has all of these points of contact, as you just said, with other forms of Yiddish culture, but it also is its own unique creation. Could you say a little bit more about what you see as the broader significance, broader implications, broader lessons of this episode for how we think about Jewish history, how we think about Yiddish, how we think about Jewish politics, how we think about French history? I think another way to frame the question I'm asking you, Nick, is can you brag a little bit more about your project and tell us a little bit more, not just about this incredibly rich moment, but about the broader lessons, broader implications, how it forces us to rethink some of what we thought we knew about Jewish history and French history?
I think that, so Eli, I appreciate the question. I think that what my attempt here to do is really kind of even further broaden the connections that people were making globally within the Yiddish-speaking world, and what that does for our understanding, right? And also some of what these Yiddish cultural activists were doing. They were trying to see themselves as belonging to the French Republic. They were learning French, but they were also doing their cultural work in Yiddish, right? And they thought that this was a viable project, right? So I think, so two things here. One, that kind of speaks to the French component, right? Because like I said, there are some people even within this French sphere that are supportive of these ideas, some of these kind of movements, which kind of pushes our understanding of what it means to be French. A lot of these cultural activists would have absolutely, Leon Glazer absolutely saw himself as French, right? But he was the progenitor of some of the major Yiddish cultural organizations in the 1920s and the 1930s, right? So it kind of gives us a different sense of like how people were trying to be French. It also shows us that in some circles, those people were perhaps being accepted to some extent. And I think, again, to Jewish history, it really just, again, like reinforces this idea that Yiddish kind of cultural activists were really engaged in a global world, and a global world that they thought they belonged to. You know, there are reporters that I write about that are based in Paris, but they're writing for newspapers in Chernovitz. They're writing for newspapers in Buenos Aires. They're reporting to New York, right? And it really just kind of gives us a sense that although we know that the Yiddish cultural world is broad, it really kind of locates it in Western Europe, right? It's not just Eastern Europe. It's not just New York. It's not some of the other places that we tend to think about. It was in many other settings as well. And like I said, I would say not even just relatively, a really thriving community that existed in Paris.
I have so many follow-up questions, and I'm resist the temptation to ask any of them and instead start sharing some of the questions that are coming in from the audience. And I want to begin with some questions about maybe sort of the internal Jewish politics, internal Jewish dynamics of the time, and then maybe broaden that out to the relationship between this Yiddish Jewish culture on the one hand and its broader French and broader non-Jewish contexts on the other. So the first question has to do with Zionism. You referred to this as a diasporic Jewish identity, a diasporic nationalism. So one question that's come in is, what role, if any, did Zionism play for the main players involved in these Yiddish cultural groups in Paris? Did they tend more towards anti-Zionist politics, Bundist perspectives? Was Zionism just not an issue for them? How does Zionism figure or not figure in the construction of this diasporic Jewish nationalism?
The Zionism question in France in the 20th century is a fascinating one, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, and if we have time. But Zionism was everything that you said, kind of anti, ambivalent, and also very present, was really part of kind of how these organizations were. So the Bundist at time, perhaps if anyone's familiar with the Bund, followed an anti-Zionist kind of line. But we also know that they're the Linke Koalition, so kind of a labor Zionist or leftist Zionist organization. They had a cultural institution, the Arbeiterheim. They were producing Yiddish culture, Zionist Yiddish culture, and they were also participating in a lot of events that the Bundists and communists were putting on. So this is one of the things that I really try to make clear in the book, is that on the level of high politics, the infighting that we can tend to think of between socialists, communists, and Zionists were absolutely relevant and absolutely present during this particular moment. But in terms of trying to create community and create a new home, these antagonistic groups were all producing events together, and they were all supporting to some extent each other's initiatives, right? In the communist newspaper, I read ads for socialist and Zionist events, right? So like there was this kind of idea that although at the level of politics there was antagonism, at the bottom grassroots level, there was some participation. The reason I say that Zionism is a fascinating question in France in the 20th century is because Zionism maintains Yiddish. During the 1930s, they keep Yiddish as the lingua franca of these organizations. And I'm actually working on a new project that begins in 44 and goes through the 1960s. And I'm tracing Yiddish cultural activists. And the Zionists maintain Yiddish as their language of production into the 1960s. So it's a very complicated. There's rarely kind of advocacy for going to originally the Palestine and then later the state of Israel. It's advocating for those, but there's very little kind of like actually compelling people to leave France and move to the Yishuv. So yeah, it is a varied, a very complicated and really kind of fascinating story. I didn't have as many sources about the 20s and 30s to write about the Arbeiterheim, so the Pavilions kind of group that I mentioned. I only have bits and pieces of kind of their involvement in some of these events, but I'm hoping to kind of flesh out some of that in a new project. But the entire spectrum was there, and it was present in conversations. But like I said, it was not entirely marginalized from these efforts to kind of create new sensibilities of belonging and home in France.
Well, maybe sticking with the theme of the complexity of internal Jewish politics, internal Jewish communal dynamics at the time, you talked about how Paris was the site of this influx of Eastern European Jewish immigrants, and that's part of the backdrop of this emergence of Yiddish culture in Paris. And we're receiving a few questions precisely about this relationship between Parisian Jewry on the one hand and Eastern European Jewry on the other. So one question is, what was the reaction among Jews living in Paris to this influx of Eastern European Jews? And a second question is, how did these Jews in Paris who had come from Eastern Europe conceptualize themselves? Did they think of themselves as French and Eastern European, simply French? So if you could say something both about the Jewish response to this influx of Eastern European Jews and the emerging forms of French Eastern European, just French, just Eastern European identity emerging from that.
Sure, absolutely. So just like everything, I will answer, it's complicated. But so with regard to the kind of traditional French Jewish community, the French Jewish community at first did not react well to the influx of these Eastern European Yiddish-speaking Jews, right? This is also perhaps a story of anyone who studies New York or Germany. This is a tale that some of us have heard before. They were really they thought they were somewhat threatened that this might kind of destabilize some of the integration that that Franco-Judaism had made really since the revolution of 1789 through the 19th century and into the early 20th century, right? We have a lot of kind of Franco-Jews really kind of integrated into the French state. So they really felt that this kind of influx was destabilizing, and especially, as I mentioned, this winds up almost doubling the Jewish population of France, this Yiddish-speaking kind of wave of immigration. So not just kind of in terms of like within the boundaries of the state, but also just kind of in terms of numbers. It's not until much, much later. So Vicky Karen's written a book called Uneasy Asylum, and she really describes that it's really in the late 1930s that the Franco-Jews, the so-called native French Jews, really start to kind of see a broader kind of connection among Jews, and they start to work with them. But it's way, way late into the refugee crisis of the 1930s. So there's that element of it. So Jews, the French Jews were not embracing early on. And I'll speak to that. I'll speak to something else I want to say about that in a second. And in terms of the Jews coming from Eastern Europe and how they saw themselves, many of them shed Yiddish, and they just kind of try to integrate and learn French and become French in the ways that they think are meaningful. And then a lot of them really kind of see this kind of intermediary of as a way to become French, right? The Yiddish Paris comes from language that I was reading in the newspaper. I didn't make it up. This is a term people were using, and we're really using it to kind of speak to kind of a rootedness in France in terms of like a seeing of belonging, seeing themselves belong there, but also kind of maintaining this Yiddish identity. The spectrum of identity, of course, like anything, is broad, but there were people who were really trying to balance these different approaches to belonging. Like I said, some completely shed it and fully integrated into kind of like, normative French French worlds. But this was also, this was the world of kind of some of the nationalist colonial movements that were happening in Paris at the time, right? So we start to see kind of a lot of sub-national groups emerge during this period, and these kind of Yiddish Jews kind of, I argue, kind of were a part of that larger kind of milieu, if you will, of kind of how people were trying to see themselves belong. So it ranged from, kind of ardent secular Yiddishists that were trying to maintain that Yiddish culture and also embrace France, and then also people kind of just learning French and becoming French in a more traditional way. One thing I'll say about this that I wanted to say is, we have this story oftentimes about how the traditional French Jews were not too keen on the Eastern European Jews come in. And there's this kind of been seemingly this tension. One of the arguments in my book is that the Eastern European Jewish community was not trying to latch themselves onto the already standing French Jewish community. They were more interested in making inroads on the left. And that's where they saw that their possible inclusion into kind of the contours of the French Republic, that's where they thought that it was possible because of support for migrants and everything that was kind of happening in some circles on the French left at this time. I don't know if that's helpful of an answer.
Absolutely. And in fact, I want to pick up on that answer to turn to the second bucket of questions that look not just at dynamics within the Jewish community and Jewish communities of the time, but at the relationship between this Yiddish culture on the one hand and broader French life, broader non-Jewish life in France. And one has to do with precisely this question of nationalism. So one question that came up in that someone has submitted has to do with the relationship between this diasporic Jewish nationalism and French nationalism. How did the two relate to one another? Did they sit well with one another? Were they mutually enforcing? Were there tensions or conflicts between the two? Can you say something more about the relationship between this diasporic Jewish nationalism and French nationalism of the time?
Sure. So, I mean, again, it depends on who you ask, right? So the spectrum of politics in interwar France is vast, right? There's multiple leftist parties, there's multiple centrist parties, and there's multiple right-wing and quasi-fascist parties as well, right? So a lot on the right would not have seen this as a viable project at all. Right, they were kind of arguing that there is a actual true France, and that it is through kind of long-standing connection to the land and language and a cultural connection, right? Kind of a standard nationalist model of understanding Frenchness. But within some circles on the left, and now I'm speaking about non-Jewish kind of French left, there were some people, anti-colonialists and others, who saw that there might be a space for kind of alternative notions of French belonging, right? That did kind of balance these two kind of sensibilities. One where one could very easily see themselves as being kind of, French, and also kind of maintain this kind of Yiddish cultural outlook. Again, like I said, this tended to be within the socialists and to some extent also within communist circles. But there were some advocates who did think that also there's an entire kind of literature about kind of anti-colonialism among the avant-garde and the left in France, and how some of these were actually kind of advocating for some of these kind of alternative nationalisms, at least in the late 1920s and in early 1930s and throughout the 1930s. So it depended on where the person was on the spectrum of French politics, and how they were engaging kind of in this in the kind of like the broader questions about how to be French and what is true France, and all the debates that were hotly contested in France at that time, still today.
So picking up on this issue of reactions and context, we have a few questions that are essentially saying, tell us more about this World's Fair pavilion. What was involved? Do any of the artifacts remain? And what kind of reaction did it inspire among other World Fair attendees, the broader public?
Okay, so the World's Fair, the Yiddish Culture Pavilion at the World's Fair is a really pretty amazing achievement. So there is a group of Jews who are involved in some of these projects. They're headed by a person who actually just had recently moved to Paris from Berlin. His name was Raphael Abramovich, and he was working on a Yiddish encyclopedia project. Barry Trachtenberg has recently written a book about. And he is selected to kind of be president of an organization to approach the World's Fair Committee and ask if there can be a Yiddish culture pavilion. They approach in April of 1937. The fair is supposed to open in August of 1937. And the first meeting for the fair is in March of 1937. And the people who are at that meeting are representatives from YIVO Paris, people from the Kulturliga, people from the Arbeiterheim, and people from the Medienverband. So the whole spectrum of kind of leftist Yiddish cultural activities, as well as some other people. Mark Chagall is also involved in the planning committee. Julius Brutzkus is, and so is a gentleman by the name of Henri Torre, who is he was the defense lawyer for Solomon Schwarzbard in 1927 for the Schwarzbard affair. So it's a pretty broad-ranging group of people who are involved in this. They wind up putting together this pavilion. It's around, I forget the exact size. It's around like 10,000 square feet. It's not an outdoor pavilion. So if anyone is familiar with Paris, the World's Fair, the main part of the World's Fair was around where the Eiffel Tower is. The Trocadero that's at the top of the Champ de Mars right now, it was actually built for the 1937 World's Fair. So if you're familiar with that area, that's where we're thinking of. A little bit down past the World's Fair, Eiffel Tower, there was this gigantic, what they called the International Pavilion. And in the International Pavilion was the Yiddish Cultural Pavilion. They had, it was aimed to being about Jewish culture in the world. There were maps about Jewish migration historically and also included kind of biblical roots of migration. There are walls dedicated to the history of Yiddish literature, not specifically Jewish literature. There's a wall of the pavilion that's about what's going on in Paris in terms of Yiddish culture. There are a whole host of kind of really informative kind of displays about, like I said, they were trying to make it that Yiddish culture has contributed to the development of European culture. The reaction was, I've actually never read any right-wing press about it, which I was kind of surprised by. But in the French language, leftist, non-Jewish press, they were celebratory. They talked about it. They mentioned the types of events that they were putting on. The Yiddish press was celebratory. Both the Zionist and the Communist were both celebratory. There is a French language Zionist newspaper that was from Alsace that actually celebrates it, but it says it should be called. It's not a pavilion of Jewish culture. It's a pavilion of Yiddish culture. And they were like, where's the Hebrew and where's the religion? So there was that criticism, but that came from, like I said, the French-speaking kind of Jewish world up in up high towards the German border. So yeah, it was it's really a remarkable achievement. They put it together really quickly. They were asked many times to pay their bill, but apparently they weren't able to. But that's okay. It still existed. Yeah, and it was really just kind of a pavilion of kind of global Yiddish culture at that time, and really trying to show the contributions in the guidebook. The cover of the book is the guidebook to the 37 World's Fair that was published to coincide with the opening of the Yiddish Culture Pavilion. They really try to situate the pavilion as a way to showcase the contributions to modern European culture that Yiddish cultural activists have made in the 19th and in the 20th century. And I mean, we should remember the stakes, right? If anyone knows the imagery of this World's Fair, this is the World's Fair that is the iconic Soviet pavilion facing off with Nazi Germany's pavilion at the World's Fair, with the Eiffel Tower kind of being the arbiter of these two extremes in the middle. So this was kind of an attempt, really. I write about how I think that this is a mode of anti-fascism and trying to kind of like maintain Yiddish culture as an attempt to kind of stabilize and maintain Jewish life on the European continent with the rise of fascism and Nazism. But yeah, I could talk forever about the Yiddish Culture Pavilion.
Well, we would love to ask you to talk forever, Nick, but as we're getting towards the close of the evening, I want to just conclude with two final questions and then some words of gratitude. And one of those questions has to do with precisely this theme of contributions and reactions that you just raised. in other contexts, we see the presence of a Yiddish culture leading to the adoption of Yiddish words into the language being spoken in an area. Do we see anything like that here? Do we see any Yiddish words entering the French language of the time? And conversely, do we see any kind of relationship between this Yiddish culture on the one hand and French anti-Semitism on the other? So that's the first question about both the adoption of Yiddish into French language and relationships between this Yiddish culture and French anti-Semitism.
So during this particular period that the book covers, I did not find any evidence that Yiddish language was making its way into kind of like spoken like French by non-Jews in the kind of like how it happens in the American context over the course of the 20th century. After the war, there is definitely more kind of Yiddish that has made its way into some French. There's still Yiddish speakers in France, like I mentioned, after the war, and that transmission starts to happen at that particular time. There is also kind of an absorption of French into Yiddish that happens as well during this particular time. And yes, French anti-Semitism is reacting to this group and some of their projects. Most notably, it was at the end of the 1938 season of this one Yiddish theater, this theater troupe I mentioned, Piat. At the end of one of their runs, the troupe members came to the door where the theater was. It wasn't Lancry, it was a different one that's still in existence in Near Republique. They found the playbill from the front door kind of torn with graffiti that said, "Hitler will come and give him the boot." And so there were French anti-Semites who were kind of reacting to some of what this immigrant Jewish community were doing in this particular sense. So yes, the French anti-Semitism was aware and very much speaking to the Yiddish-speaking Jewish presence in France, as much as the kind of more long-standing French Jewish presence.
Well, that is a striking image, Nick, and I want to share one final question from the Q&A, also relating to an image and imagery more broadly. And it picks up, I think, on some of the initial imagery you shared. And the question here has to do with the gendered nature of this imagery. Much of the imagery you shared seems to be strikingly gendered. Could you say a little bit more about the role of gender in your own research into Yiddish culture in Paris and the role of gender in this French Jewish cultural context more broadly?
Yeah, so the cover of the book, I think, is kind of speaks to this. I mean, I think, when I read a lot of these kind of Yiddish cultural use of women within the French Republican context as a reference to Marianne, the female embodiment of the French Republic, right? So there is very much a gendered component to how some of these cultural activists are positioning themselves and positioning some of their projects. And then in a very, very basic way, it is a broad spectrum. I tried very, very hard in this project to tease out like who was involved. I remember an early meeting. I was at someone's house and they invited their friend over to dinner, and it wound up being the son of one of the editors of the Naya Press, of the communist Yiddish language newspaper from the 1930s. And he told me, he was like, my mother was just as involved with this as my father was. And he was like, my father gets all the credit, but my mother was the one who was also there doing all this work. And it really kind of urged me to really kind of broaden the scope of who is doing this. And again, it kind of fed into this kind of bottom-up approach to how this activism was happening. And what I found is that when we look at things like theater and we look at things like chorus groups, we see a very diverse kind of gender participation, right? We have women and men kind of participating and really kind of contributing to the way that this entire kind of project is being positioned. And it depends, again, on where you are. In the Naya Pressa, when women are addressed, it's usually only through the lens of fashion and children. And there was an entire kind of life in Paris section that was dedicated mostly to women, and it kind of talked about what to do with children, and it sometimes gave like patterns for clothing. To these extents, but really the role that gender plays, it has a lot to do with kind of like signaling to kind of some French Republican ideals, again, the idea of Marianne, but also I think kind of like trying to position themselves within a broader kind of secular Jewish world that really kind of gave a platform, or at least a stage, to a variety of people to participate in this project. So I don't know if that answers the question successfully or satisfyingly, but that's kind of was the approach and what I found as I was kind of working through this project.
Well, Nick, there is so much more we could discuss, but unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our time together. But I really want to thank you for this presentation. And as we end our time together tonight, I just want to offer a few additional words of gratitude, and then a look forward to the rest of this year. So first, some additional words of gratitude to all the folks and sources that made tonight's event possible, to the CU Office for Outreach and Engagement, to the David Schneer Fund for Community Programming, Public Scholarship, and the Arts, to all of our peak-to-peak partners, to our tech guru, Dan Shostad, to Danya Rivlin and Eyal Rivlin. That music you heard at the beginning of tonight's program was their song Shalom from their album Coming Home. To my colleagues in Jewish Studies, Angela Watts and Maggie Rosenau, on putting all of this together, and most importantly to Professor Underwood. Nick, I've had the pleasure and privilege of learning with you since that seminar in 2012, and it was wonderful to get to learn with you tonight, and I'm looking forward to doing so in the future. And because Professor Underwood is too modest to do so, I'm once again putting a link to his book and the promo codes to his book in the chat. If you haven't ordered the book, order it. If you've already ordered it, order another copy. There is someone in your life who needs to be reading this book. So those are some words of gratitude. Also want to let everyone know that we have lots of other programming in the program in Jewish Studies, both virtually and in person, over the course of this year. In November, we will be gathering both in person and online for a symposium on food and Jewish identity called Know Your Nosh, Food, Jewishness, and Identity, thinking about food and Jewish identity in an American Jewish context and in Israel-Palestine. In January, we will join together for International Holocaust Remembrance Day. More details coming soon. In February, we will be welcoming our annual Bender scholar, Julia Watts-Belzer from Georgetown University, who will be speaking about climate change in Judaism. In March, we will be back to our in-person Hebrew Shmoozapalooza concert. The image you see is of students joining together to sing in Hebrew in public, and that's precisely what happens. And then in April, we'll have our annual programming with the CU Anschutz Center for Bioethics and Humanities, this year focusing on health and human rights in times of war. We'll have other programs as well. I hope to see many of you at those programs. And finally, some final words of gratitude. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. You know, for many of us, the past 2 years have been a time when kind of genuine human connections are hard to come by. And against that backdrop, I just want to say how grateful I am for what it's meant and for what it continues to mean to be a part of this type of community, to be a part of this kind of space where individuals from diverse backgrounds can come together to join, learn, think, and grow with one another. Thank you, one and all. Have a wonderful evening.